I think we're going to get started. We got a couple more minutes here, but I think we'll just get started. We got a packed panel here. We've got a great day. I'd love to start with some opening remarks, and then we'll get right into the panel. I'm Teddy Downey, CEO and Executive Editor at the Capitol Forum. Just wanted to thank you all for coming out to the event today. We're really privileged to have an incredible lineup of speakers at a really ideal time. Upcoming decisions from regulators are likely to affect the competitive landscape of tech, media, and telecom industries for years to come. And before we get started with the program, I'd like to make a couple points. First, I wanted to share what I've observed over the last 2.5 years after starting the company about what I've seen it means to be a Capitol Forum subscriber. And everyone in here is part of the Capitol Forum subscriber community. We've got policymakers, we've got investors, corporate decision makers, legal scholars, and academic thought leaders. And there are certain characteristics that tie all of our subscribers together. First, TCF subscribers are dedicated to accurately predicting future outcomes and future events and how markets will play out. Our work is first and foremost forward-looking, and our community is always looking for ways to improve our ability to forecast future events. And I'd note that at the front, when you walked in at our registration table, we have a forecasting survey that I'd encourage everyone to take part in, and we'll have the results for our subscribers hopefully by the end of the conference, but if we can't work that out in the next couple of days. Second, TCF subscribers are really students of the law and students of markets. Our subscribers appreciate in-depth knowledge of competition policy, can really yield valuable insight into how that competition will play out. Third, TCF subscribers have an appreciation for the truth and the investigative process. There's a lot of information out there, there's a lot of noise, there are a lot of arguments, and TCF subscribers do their best to assess what information is accurate and whether an argument is compelling. And lastly, TCF subscribers have a profound interest in understanding decision makers and the decision-making process. Part of understanding how a policy decision is going to be made is to really dig into people's biases, people's ideology, people's relationships, and understand how they're going to make a decision. And then lastly, the other topic I really quickly wanted to touch on is there are three real main goals for the conference here. To answer the three goals are part of three questions that are overarching the whole conference. What are the policy options before the regulators and enforcers? What should they do, and what are they likely to do? And as long as we're answering one of those questions throughout these panels, and you can see through the questions that we have laid out here, there's some aspect of digging into one of those three questions. And so with that, I just wanted to thank again our Capitol Forum subscriber community for coming today, and we'll get started with the panel. And before we jump into the questions, I thought maybe we could just move this way and everyone could introduce themselves, and then we could get started, if that works.
Sure. Ross Lieberman, Senior Vice President of the American Cable Association, representing over 800 small and medium-sized cable television operators across the country.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Blum. I'm the Deputy General Counsel of Dish Network.
Erin McGrath, Office of Commissioner O'Reilly at the FCC. I am one of his legal advisors.
Diana Moss, currently Vice President of the American Antitrust Institute.
I'm Seth Bloom. I have my own firm, Bloom Strategic Counsel, and I represent Comcast, so the comments I'm going to give today are my own views.
And I'm John Bergmar. I'm with Public Knowledge, and in these video issues, we try to represent the interest of viewers.
So, and with that, this first panel is focused on understanding how policymakers want to achieve competition in video distribution and high bandwidth applications. And let's just jump into the first question here. are the DOJ and FCC going to think of the Comcast, Time Warner Cable, and AT&T DirecTV mergers as within the scope of broader regulation or as distinct transactions outside the scope of broader regulation? And this came up, I wanted to point to Seth because he wanted to talk about this very specifically, and then we can jump to people who may or may not agree with what he has to say.
Thank you, Teddy, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this panel, and thanks to all for coming. I mean, it's my view, these transactions are going to be evaluated on their own merits. You know, the Justice Department has an obligation under Section 7 of the Clayton Act to determine whether or not the merger is likely to tend to injure a substantial injury to competition, and the FCC enforces the Communications Act on whether or not these transactions are in the public interest. As I say, they stand or fall on their own merits. It's, you know, at the Justice Department, there's no question about that. The Justice Department's not a regulatory agency. It examines mergers under these standards. But at the FCC, which applies the public interest standard, a lot of it is informed by the competition analysis and the public interest of you know, whether or not the transaction is in the public interest. Now, we'll talk about this later, and we don't have to get into this now because it's beyond the scope of your question. I think that both these, the Comcast Time Warner Cable merger certainly meets the, does not violate the antitrust laws in any way, and so should get approved. And I think it's also in the public interest. But I think we'll have an opportunity to discuss that further.
Yeah. Diana?
Yeah, just a quick comment on this. And I agree with Seth, as far as the DOJ is concerned, they do have to evaluate each transaction on the merits. And from a regulatory perspective, I'll speak as a former regulator. I worked at FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, for years during the mid-90s when we had a huge merger wave. And it was impossible and probably irresponsible for the commission from a policy standpoint not to consider transactions going on around other transactions. We used to do, you know, lots of scenario analysis, looking at the effect of a transaction, looking at the effect of other transactions. Should another transaction occur? I think it was important to get sort of the lay of the land and a sense of the landscape if there were multiple transactions on deck, and what the effect of those transactions would be. So I agree with Seth, but at the same time, I think it's a hard problem for regulators to solve, and they necessarily have to consider everything that's going on simultaneously.
So I think everyone knows what an antitrust harm looks like when you're reviewing these mergers. I think there's a second category of harm, though, which is not just the showing of a public interest benefit, but a public interest harm. And in particular transactions, sometimes there might be a harm which is maybe a little too speculative for antitrust purposes because it requires a lot of, you know, prediction and industry expertise. And there, I think the FCC can recognize a kind of public interest harm, which is a real harm, but it might still be just like a little too predictive, maybe for the Department of Justice. But I think another question, which I think particularly comes up in the AT&T transaction, is that it's necessary for companies to actually show a public interest benefit. And I think there's a real question as to what can consist of a public interest benefit. Is it just sort of unverifiable promises about future efficiencies, or does it have to be a little bit more concrete and enforceable? And I think that when you're looking for an actual positive benefit, I think that's sometimes where people fall short on their analysis, because they stop at sort of looking at the harms and counteracting the harms without showing that extra benefit which is necessary, at least for the FCC.
And, yeah.
Obviously, these transactions will be before my boss in the coming months, so I can't really address the particulars, but I did spend an incredible amount of time at the commission reviewing transactions in past positions. And, you know, as people have mentioned, the FCC role is a little bit different from DOJ. We have a public interest benefit standard, and that standard has been known to be broad. And I think that in looking at how the FCC tends to look at transactions, you can't look at it in a bubble. Policy objectives have been known to come into play, especially when conditions are being imposed, and vice versa. A lot of the times they will take conditions that have been in certain transactions and then say, oh, for the sake of regulatory parity, we will apply that on a broader basis. Now, you know, of course, that raises the question of, is that the correct approach? And that is a, you know, full-time debate for another time.
Good morning. Some of you may know DISH opposes the Comcast Time Warner transaction. We believe it violates antitrust laws. It is not in the public interest, and our beliefs are supported by many others. I agree with Aaron in the sense that each transaction, of course, we're going to look at the evidence, and the regulators are going to decide what to do. But in the case of Comcast Time Warner, where the harms are so significant in so many different buckets, whether it's broadband, programming, advertising, set-top box, the amount of control that Comcast Time Warner is going to have is enormous throughout all those markets. And the notion that it's going to be approved without conditions, I don't think anyone believes that, even Comcast. And if it's approved, the amount and degree of conditions is going to be so enormous. I mean, the Comcast NBC conditions are nothing compared to the conditions that conceivably the FCC may want to impose here, and that raises some serious concerns. If you have to have a transaction loaded up with so many conditions in order to address the harms, ultimately, is that in the public interest? And we think no. We don't think conditions could come close to alleviating the harms and create policy problems going forward in terms of the FCC deciding what they need to do in the public interest broadly as part of their rulemaking authority. And we hope that the FCC, as they evaluate the transaction, says, look, the public benefits from the transaction are de minimis, if any, and we could talk about that. I'm sure Seth disagrees with me, but we could go into the evidence on that. The harms are real. And then the question is, do you attempt to alleviate those harms through conditions? And the question that the FCC has to ask is, if they get it wrong, there's no going back. Comcast, Time Warner are together. And if you have all these conditions that ultimately fail, how is that good for the public?
Sure, I don't have much more to say, and I don't disagree with a lot that has been said. I think the DOJ and the FCC is going to conclude that this transaction causes, both the Comcast Time Warner Cable and AT&T DirecTV creates harms for consumers and competition that aren't resolvable within the scope of existing regulations, and that they're going to look at conditions, and they're going to determine if they can impose conditions to mitigate those harms. They'll approve the deal, and if they can't, they'll deny it.
And maybe we can get back to this broader topic that Jeff brought up with the complexity of the conditions. We put out a piece recently that sort of walks through what structural conditions would look like versus behavioral conditions. I'd be interested in everyone's comments on the complexity of the conditions, if they're necessary, and what do complex conditions say about the law or the merger or the way that these agencies approach their reviews?
So let me answer that by talking about what are the simplest conditions in Comcast NBC. Bloomberg basically said, I want my channel to be in the same news neighborhood as CNBC, owned by Comcast NBC, in the electronic program guide. It was a 2-sentence condition. Everyone thought, oh, of course this is going to happen. Comcast fought that condition for 3 years at the FCC, arguing we don't know what news is, we don't know what news neighborhood is. 3 years of litigation until there was a settlement, which occurred, ironically, after Comcast announced the merger with Time Warner. If the simplest condition takes 3 years of litigation, imagine an interconnection condition, or a specialized services condition, or a programming condition dealing with set-top boxes. You just have to look at the track record of failed behavioral conditions, and I think there's a growing sense in DC that behavioral conditions are not going to be able to cut it. They didn't work in Comcast NBC, and if we're going to approve it, are there going to be structural conditions that we impose? And if there are structural conditions, those are likely deal killers. Let's have Comcast divest all of NBC programming, or let's have Comcast open up their broadband pipe. I don't think Comcast would open up their pipe willingly.
So I'd like to address a few things that were said. First of all, on the Bloomberg situation, I don't think that was quite as simple. There was a question of definition of a news neighborhood, but in any event, that was resolved. That's not a dispute today. But if you look at the entirety of the Comcast NBCU conditions, which were quite voluminous, and I think there was an account I saw, it was 150 conditions or something like that, it's very difficult to identify any conditions that even the opponents of this the Comcast deal say have been violated. Basically, I think Comcast has an exemplary record in complying with these conditions. I mean, there's one other dispute with Tennis Channel, which was resolved in Comcast's favor. And beyond that, there really are no other disputes. Given the voluminous nature of those conditions, I think Comcast has an excellent record in complying with conditions. But let's step back for a second, because the assumption, Teddy, in your question is that this is going to be subject to an enormous number of conditions. But for there to be conditions, there have to be competitive harms. And so maybe we can, and it's my view that there really aren't substantial competitive harms here. And
Can we just get a quick raise of hands on who thinks, or maybe Aaron can't vote on this, but who thinks that there are going to be conditions on the, just raise your hand on the panel if you think there are going to be conditions on the merger or block. I mean, I guess the only thing is I want to, yeah. So the issue is more that I just want to make sure that if everyone agrees there's going to be conditions, which I don't think there's a lot of concern about, I don't, and please finish because I think I know where this is going, but I want to stick on the condition topic to the extent that we can.
well, there were conditions on Comcast NBCU, and obviously when Comcast acquires Time Warner Cable, those Time Warner Cable systems will be subject to those conditions. There are conditions on the open internet, which Comcast has abided by and supports, even though the open internet order has been struck down by the courts. I mean, so, there's certain basic things we all can agree on, but I just want to get into this, just to assume that it's going to be massively riddled with conditions. Think about the transaction. If you think about the transaction from the video side, you have two companies that don't compete. Comcast and Time Warner Cable on the video side do not compete. They don't share overlapping markets, and the same competitive choices that exist before the merger will exist after the merger. And so I don't see, on the video side where there's a justification for that. On the broadband side, I can make the same analysis. And in addition to that, we have seen a whole, the companies don't compete in the provision of internet service. Internet service is a local, you buy it in a specific geographic area. So, these national numbers really don't have much meaning. But if you think about, internet service, there are so many new burgeoning forms of competition, such as wireless, that I think the concerns there are overblown. But I think the basic point here is you have to identify competitive harms if you're going to put conditions on, and the burden's on those folks to identify the competitive harms rather than just some exaggerated story. The other thing is, I just have to say this, mentioning about there's no benefits here. I think there's substantial benefits here. Comcast will offer Time Warner Cable subscribers higher speed internet connections, increased video choices. They'll have the benefit of that open internet order, so net neutrality protections. I mean, I could go on. It's really not true that there aren't benefits arising out of the merger. And of course, the FCC is going to have to weigh the benefits against what the opponents consider to be the detriments and make a decision. I'm confident they'll come out on the side that it is in the public interest.
Teddy, can I respond to some of what Seth is saying? And I'll just make two comments, sort of two categories of comment. One is, as to whether Comcast Time Warner Cable raises competitive concerns, I think it's pretty clear that it does. And AAI has focused in our work on what we're calling the gatekeeper concern, obviously, which is Comcast controls the gate off the superhighway onto the sort of the local roads, and they are very much in a position to demand and extract tolls and frustrate access in a way that could hamper competition in online video. I think that's if you look at incentive and ability, combining two broadband distributors into a single company certainly provides incentive to engage in this kind of foreclosure. And it's been demonstrated through disputes with Level 3 and Cogent and Netflix that they have the ability to frustrate access. So, just because those disputes may be old, it doesn't mean that they don't demonstrate that Comcast has the ability to frustrate access. And they would certainly have the incentive as a ginormous broadband distributor. So that's an important point. But I want to make another point, which is to come more up to the 10,000-foot level and talk about this access problem. The consolidation in broadband is driving the access access problem in the middle market. It's driving the access problem in transit and interconnection. If you had lots of competition at various levels, access wouldn't be such a problem. But when you have big, dominant broadband distributors, that is exacerbating this emergent access problem in broadband. And from the FCC's perspective, they have a very tough job to address both the access issue, not only from a statutory perspective, but from a functional, how do you develop an access regime perspective. But then they have all this merger activity, which is creating this moving landscape, which is exacerbating the access problem. That's the difficulty that the FCC faces. And I know this sounds kind of hokey, but having worked at FERC during the whole open access movement and all the mergers that were generated by deregulation, we dealt with exactly this very same problem in electricity. There are huge parallels between what happened in electricity and what's happening in broadband. And there are lessons to be taken and lessons to be learned from other regulatory experiences. And I wish a lot more of that would sort of port over. But it's a very difficult policy problem, and it's a very difficult problem when it comes to evaluating and conditioning mergers. I don't think that you can fix the access problem by imposing behavioral conditions on Comcast, Time Warner Cable. That would be like fixing, that's fixing a generic emergent problem with very specific conditions in a merger. That is bad policy. That's bad policy to fix an access issue with merger-specific behavioral conditions. That is a recipe for failure, and it's a recipe for no competition and harm to consumers.
And Comcast's antitrust argument is dangerous. Under their argument, we don't compete with Time Warner because we've created separate monopolies in each of our cable systems. There's no limiting principle. If their argument was accepted, post-merger, Comcast Time Warner could buy Cablevision, Cox, and Charter. They say that, we voluntarily went down to the 30%, but on one hand, they say that's not a legal requirement. They're doing it because they're nice. So if you get the argument that it's not legally required to be under 30%, and you accept their antitrust argument, there's no limiting principle. We think the market is national. The DOJ has said the market is national in very similar circumstances in the AT&T Media One case, where the DOJ said because AT&T was trying to acquire Excite and Roadrunner, two of the key portals at that time, who, by the way, had separate geographic areas, AT&T, if they controlled both, would control the input. To your point, they would be the gatekeeper. Similarly here, post-merger, Comcast Time Warner would control over 50% of the high-speed broadband connections in the United States. That is gatekeeper. And all the great things that Seth talked about that are happening in TV today, all these over-the-top services, we're about to launch one, Sony, what's happening with Netflix, that's great. We're in the golden age of TV. But all those services, whose pipe do you think it will depend upon to get to the consumer? Post-merger on a national basis. 50% of that pipe will be controlled by Comcast Time Warner. We think that presents anti-competitive harms that cannot be addressed by merger conditions. And Seth is just wrong when he says there was no merger condition that there was other disputes about. There were, and there were a lot. The FCC fined Comcast for violating the standalone broadband condition. There was a company called Project Concord, an over-the-top company, that had to litigate with Comcast for 2 years before the FCC vindicated Project Concord on their core claim. But you know what? By the time they got vindication, they went out of business. Comcast violated the data cap condition. Public Knowledge had brought a FCC complaint saying that Comcast was excluding its own content from data caps. So there's a panoply of violated conditions. But even if there weren't, the degree of complexity over the broadband pipe and all the different ways that Comcast Time Warner can engage in sabotage of its competitors are subtle, complex, difficult to detect, prone to delays and litigation. For all of those reasons, conditions just can't cut it.
And can I just add one thing to that, and then I'll cede the floor. Dealing with complex economic engineering access problems like you would find in broadband access and like we found in electricity access or even natural gas access, dealing with that is really the job of a regulator. It's not the job of an antitrust enforcer. Antitrust enforcers are not cut out to be engineering economists to craft complex interconnection standards, interconnection protocols, transit pricing tier, you know, the whole package of potential parts that go into an access regime. That's not for an antitrust enforcer, that's for a regulator. So in crafting behavioral remedies through the antitrust channel, that, in my mind, that goes back to the point I made earlier, which is that's just bad policy. You can't fix a big access problem through behavioral remedies in an antitrust case.
Well, Diane, I agree with your point that those issues are not for antitrust regulators, and so I'll agree with that. But I just want to address what Jeff was saying. So on this sort of parade of horribles about broadband, first of all, I don't accept the 50% market share. I think when numbers like that are thrown around about broadband, it's really not realistically looking at the market today. And I have some statistics. 78% of households have the choice of at least 3 fixed broadband providers with at least 3 megabytes. 92% have the choice of at least 2 offering 10 megabytes downstream. And I think, so one thing this kind of argument excludes are a couple of things. Number one, DSL. And when I mention DSL, people laugh at it. It's not laughable if you look at the statistics. DSL is actually growing at a faster pace than cable broadband. Between June of 2009 and June of 2013, DSL growth was 30%, 30.7%. Cable broadband growth at a rate of 18%. I'd argue there that shows consumers are voting with their feet. If DSL was an inferior service, as I often hear, you wouldn't see consumers preferring it in a higher rate, in a growth rate, than cable broadband. And in fact, 20 of the 60 ISP providers recommended by Netflix are DSL providers. But there's another big thing that I think the argument that they have 50% totally ignores, which is mobile. You know, anybody who goes into an airport today and looks at a waiting area sees people looking at their devices, and they're not getting that through a Comcast wired broadband connection. Go to any any coffee shop. And of course, people do this in their homes as well. To some extent, that's Wi-Fi, but to some extent, it's not. I think the percentage of the U.S. population that has access to a mobile provider offering broadband speeds of at least 10 megabytes downstream increased from 8% in December 2010 to 97.5% in June of 2013. Again, I think we have to look at the realities of the market today. If Comcast was engaged in the kind of conduct, or any cable provider, people can switch, and they would switch. So I think those are important facts. As to the point about there's no limiting principle. First of all, it's a basic principle that when you look at a merger, you look at the merger before you, not something else that's going to happen. But you're right, Comcast has voluntarily agreed to stay under this 30% cap by selling off systems. The only possible problem, since there's no competition at the consumer level, is competition for programming. But when you're under 30%, that leaves 70% of the MVPD market unaffected by this merger. And of course, it doesn't even deal with over-the-top, video over the internet, online video. So, I mean, I think let's not lose sight of what this deal's about, and also let's not lose sight of the market realities.
Can we go ahead?
If you want to move on, that's
go
okay.
ahead. I'd love to just take a step back here. We're talking a lot about the merger, and we're really trying to talk about programming or achieving competition in video distribution. So I don't want to cut people off, but Jeff raised an interesting point that there are potential harms in broadband, programming, set-top box, advertising. We're trying to focus a little bit more on programming here, but there are a lot of rules ongoing at the FCC on broadband programming, potentially on set-top box, and a lot of these areas. I'd be interested in, we're trying to figure out what are the best options for regulators to promote competition in these areas. What are the best ideas, in your opinions, for achieving better competition if you think there's problems in these areas, and are those likely regulations to occur in the near term and in enough time to address some of the concerns with the mergers? Anyone have a?
Sure. I mean, obviously, the most fundamental thing that the FCC can do to promote competition in video distribution is the work it's doing in protecting the open internet, and it needs to look at the emerging problems in the interconnection market. I think those are the two most fundamental things, and everything else, there's things it can do beyond that. But it really, those are the basics, and those are the things that it probably needs to do more or less on an ongoing basis, given the current market structure. I mean, there are some things that it's doing. For example, it's been reported that they're on the issue of clarifying the definition of MVPD. When Congress adopted the definition of MVPD in 1992, it was very technology neutral. I think it totally makes sense for the FCC to recognize that it's technologically neutral and it doesn't depend on being a cable system or being a satellite system. It's just sort of what the service looks like to consumers. I think that's an important item, but it's not going to be an earthquake because it's not like the FCC is sort of saying that Netflix or Hulu are now regulated as MVPDs because they don't offer a service which is similar. They offer on-demand services, although it could be important sort of incrementally going forward as sort of the basis for further FCC rulemakings. So I think there's a lot of little things it can do. Set-top boxes are important. Making sure that people can actually access online video apps on their home TVs, I think, is very important. But all those are sort of important things that still, when compared to just the basic problem of ensuring that online video providers can access customers through the internet. I mean, that's the most fundamental important thing. And then once you take care of that, then you can maybe look at the more detailed items.
So I will, most consumers in the marketplace have at least 3 video providers, cable operator, 2 satellite providers. In some markets, there's 4 or 5, particularly in urban markets. From the perspective of small cable operators, the biggest problem is really with the programming market and the consolidation of the programming market, as well as the vertical integration that is occurring between programmers and MVPDs. And I think the Comcast Time Warner Cable and AT&T mergers actually exacerbate the problem. The increasing level of vertical integration with Comcast NBCU. We saw Liberty purchase Charter. They have ownership interests in programming. Comcast Time Warner Cable now increases it further. With consolidation, we've seen massive broadcaster consolidation in the last couple of years. We've seen rumors of the sale of Time Warner, Discovery, Starz. So this market is, the competitive problems for a lot of at least small and medium-sized operators is the consolidation, vertical integration in the programming market. With vertical integration, which is an interest that a harm that ACA has raised in the Comcast Time Warner Cable, if you own programming, you have an incentive and ability to raise prices for your rivals who are dependent upon that programming. And that's a harm in this merger. It's a harm that the Commission has recognized in previous mergers of this sort, and it's imposed conditions that haven't worked in the past. So kind of like Seth says, oh, they never violated the condition. Well, if the condition doesn't work in the first place and my members can't utilize it, it's hard to say that it's ever really been violated, but that goes to a failure in the drafting of the condition. In terms of consolidation, when you have a programmer that's going to own a regional sports network and a local broadcast station in the same market, which will occur in New York and Los Angeles, they're able to extract higher prices by threatening to withdraw both types of programming at the same time. And that drives up the cost that consumers will eventually have to pay for that programming. So these are 2 important issues that if we want to see a video market work, irrespective of whether over-the-top comes into existence or not, they're still going to have to buy this programming from those same programmers that cable and satellite operators provide for. So if you think over-the-top is going to solve the problem, it's not going to be the cure-all that we all think. So finally, just in terms of policy options, there's stronger program access rules. There's rules that prevent broadcasters and programmers exercising bargaining power in ways that harms consumers. We've seen blackouts happen. We've seen online blackouts happening for the first time, which could be a growing trend. We also need the need for greater choice. Senator Thune put out an idea for local choice, which give consumers the option of choosing to buy broadcast stations at the prices that the broadcasters choose. These are some ideas that I think will help address this programming industry problem.
Consumers have more choice than they've ever had before. I mean, you can watch broadcast, you can go on cable, you can go to Netflix and your other online options, and all of these options have come out of a light regulatory approach as far as video programming on the internet. And the one thing that we have to be careful of is that in looking to either, as you said, or referred to, looking at MVPDs for classification for over-the-top guys. We have to make sure that we don't have any unintended consequences. We don't want to stop the next Netflix or Hulu or whatever Sony's going to end up doing, or Dish, whatever product is that they're going to put over the top. We just have to keep a very close eye on how our regulations and an MVPD status or any other direction the Commission would happen to go, how it could affect innovation and the entrepreneurship that we have seen on the internet. We just need to make sure that we don't do anything to stymie that.
Can I just add one thought here, and it sort of pulls together some themes that we've already heard, but you know, look at what's happening in broadband now and assume that this should be a laissez-faire kind of situation in terms of regulatory oversight. And I mean regulatory oversight light versus regulatory oversight, you know, heavy, I think is a little naive for folks to approach the problem that way. All the disputes that are occurring in transit and interconnection right now are, as I said earlier, are being driven by consolidation. And you made this point just a minute ago, it reinforced in earlier comment, that vertical integration it exacerbates incentive and ability to foreclose competition. Horizontal consolidation increases incentive to foreclose and to serve as gatekeeper. You couldn't possibly expect not to have disputes over peering and settlement versus settlement-free, and how to price access to the internet superhighway, the middle market. You couldn't possibly expect that. So what's developing in broadband and being exacerbated by the mergers, Time Warner, Comcast, Time Warner Cable in particular, is a logical, predictable outcome of what's gone on with consolidation, vertical and horizontal, and the fact that you have a set of pipes, and whenever you have sets of pipes in a network, you need some sort of regulatory oversight. And I'm not going to say what kind of oversight is necessary, but that's the emergent problem that we face here. Behavioral conditions aren't going to fix that. And behavioral conditions in previous mergers, whether it's Comcast, NBCU, or whether it's Ticketmaster, Live Nation, or whether it's Google ITA, or whether it's another of an entire host of merger cases that have come down the line where behavioral remedies have proven to be really difficult to enforce, difficult to monitor. Firms develop workarounds because they have every incentive to continue to maximize profits and engage in that kind of behavior. This should all be really good evidence. And if there was ever a time for us to learn, both on the regulatory side and the antitrust side, in terms of competition policy, to learn that behavioral remedies don't work, this would be the time, because we're asking a lot of behavioral remedies if this merger were to proceed under those circumstances.
And I think what's shifting, to Ross's point, the rising programming costs, the requirement of a bundle, is making broadband critical for video consumption. Before, they were sort of siloed, but now when you think about video, it's going to be about broadband. And who is going to control those pipes? You're not going to watch 6 hours of House of Cards in 4K on your wireless connection unless you're a millionaire, because your monthly bill will be $4,000. Wireless is not the relevant market for watching long-form HD streaming video. How many people have a DSL connection in this room? Raise your hand. Right, 0. And the reason is because cable is better. And last week, the Media Bureau issued a letter in the Comcast-Time Warner merger, and it addressed the point that Seth was trying to make. In markets where there's DSL available at 10 megs and cable broadband, 98% of consumers choose cable. And there's a reason. It's better. DSL is not up to snuff to watch long-form HD video. So if you exclude wireless, because of data caps, you exclude DSL, which has lost 1 million customers. And if you look at Comcast's own marketing material, what I find funny, before the FCC, they're saying, oh, 4 megs is enough. You'll be fine to watch long-form HD video with 4 megs. Go to Xfinity on your computers right now and look at their internet plans. They don't even offer a 4 meg plan. Their lowest plan is 6 megs. You know what they say it's good for? Downloading photos and listening to music. Their 25 meg plan says streaming video, not even HD. It's when you get into the 50 meg plan is where streaming HD video with multiple uses, that's what they're selling to consumers. So that either they're lying to the FCC that 4 megs is enough, or they're lying to consumers. They can't have it both ways. And if you're at 25 megs or more, you are at 50% of all the high-speed broadband connections in the United States. And that can't be good for all the things that consumers want to do with video today. So you have this trend, people want to watch video using broadband. You're going to have one company controlling half of those pipes. Is that in the public interest? We think not.
And I think the punchline here is that, we heard a lot from Seth about growth and DSL and growth and this and that. Okay, fine, growth. The question is not whether consumers could switch. The question is whether consumers would switch. So could and would are really the dividing line here. And so show of hands, how many people would voluntarily dump their cable broadband connection to go to DSL? Okay, so that's the it depends on the price, it depends on convenience, it depends on tastes and preferences, it depends on location. I mean, we could go through a whole laundry list of what conditions and circumstances are in place. Possibly yes.
And actually,
do we see a lot of switching between cable broadband and DSL? Do we have statistics on that?
Yeah, we do have statistics on that. Actually, not on switching, but there was a survey that's in Comcast public interest filings before the FCC by the Global Strategy Group, and addressing the question if their broadband subscriber would degrade, block or degrade access. 70% of folks surveyed said they would switch, even if to a slower speed.
That was a consumer. Was that a Consumer Report survey?
No, that was a survey by Global Strategy Group. It was an independent group.
Okay, so they said that they would switch.
They would switch.
Okay, so then the question is, well, what are the choices available? And if we believe Chairman Wheeler when he talks about how wireless is not a very good substitute for wired broadband connections, if we look at old DOJ complaints and competitive impact statements where the DOJ in the past has cast doubt on whether wireless is a good substitute for wired connections. I think that there's enough sentiment and evidence out there that the kitchen sink is not the relevant market here. The relevant market does not include every conceivable form of access to the internet.
It doesn't, but I think we have to pay attention to developments in the market. We didn't talk about, Google's developing new fiber to the home in new cities. There's new technologies that people talk about. Again, and I heard what you said about wireless. Actually, I'm gonna do a commercial for another client of mine because Sprint offers unlimited data plans, which I have. And so if you want to watch on a Sprint device a video, you can do that, and it's not going to lead to enormous costs. I just don't think, I don't think 25 megabytes is the standard today, and I think 10 megabytes is pretty good. And as I said in the statistics, not to repeat myself, but I will. The statistic is that 97.5% in June of 2013 have access to 10 megabytes downstream from a wireless connection. 97% of percentage of the U.S. population.
Can we open it up to questions or for the audience? Or do you want to finish up, Seth?
Well, I just want, the other thing I was going to say, one small point, and then yes, certainly open up to questions. This idea of consolidation of programming. It's interesting that in 1992, when the 1992 Cable Act was enacted, the 57% of cable programming was vertically integrated. Today, the statistic today is less than 15%, 15%. And there's very little, Time Warner Cable has very little programming. So that's not really an issue in the Comcast-Time Warner Cable merger. I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, great. Do we have any questions from the audience?
I thought you asked a very good question when you asked about regulations that would enhance competition. And John and Diana answered that. Sure. Well, okay. I thought you asked a very good question when you asked about regulations that enhance competition. And Diana answered that, John answered it. And the question I have is that suggests a situation where you have the regulators under public interest standard doing competition policy, while, and John at the outset said something about the antitrust division doing competition policy with some limitations to it. And my question is, what is the coordination between antitrust division and the regulators when the regulators are doing, for example, rules on competition policy? And what should be the coordination between the regulators and the antitrust division when it comes to doing rules that affect competition policy?
I mean, it's hard to speak to exactly how the different agencies ought to be talking to each other when, in some respects, apart from merger reviews, they're doing a different job. The regulators are very often sort of making sure that a market that exists functions effectively, or sometimes they're even trying to create a market. I think when it comes to some of the set-top box regulations, they are mandated by Congress to promote a market, to essentially create one by making sure there are standards. When it comes to some of the pro-competition video policy, which I didn't really get too much into, that's where, you know, an online video provider, or any video provider, in addition to access to the viewers, which is in the internet context, I think the pipes issue, they need access to content. I think the FCC's, a lot of its regulatory work with video, which was very successful with regard to satellite TV, ensuring that satellite TV could succeed, was really about ensuring access to content. And I think, you know, ensuring access to content is maybe something that the antitrust regulators can do, but to really ensure it's effective, it's sort of just very different than I think the work that an antitrust regulator would do.
Yeah, and if I could just respond.
We have a regulator here, so maybe we should hear from her first.
No, I can't speak as to exactly what is going on in this transaction because I'm not on the ground working on the actual transaction. But in the past, yes, there is considerable interaction between DOJ and the FCC, and to an extent that's necessary because you certainly do not want the two agencies coming out with conditions or decisions that contradict each other, because that would be a huge issue if the conditions would end up conflicting, and so then the entities wouldn't know how to comply. So we do everything we can to ensure that that doesn't happen. So there's also a sharing of information. Parties will submit sometimes more information to DOJ before they ask for in the FCC. The FCC will go over to DOJ and look at it, primarily because there are different standards for protecting information between the two agencies. But coordination between the agencies is constant between staff. Then when it comes up to the commissioner level, pretty much that starts to peter away because at that point the coordination has been done already.
Seth, do you want to?
No, I have nothing to add to that. Those are pretty much the points that I was going to make. So thank you.
This is a question, I guess, mostly for Ross, because he brought up vertical integration, but I'm certainly happy to hear the comments of everybody. In a weird way, do you think on the Comcast-Time Warner merger, the ownership of NBC Universal, if that were not part of the mix, that it would be somewhat easier or more cut and dry to analyze and adjudicate this process? And then secondly, given that NBC Universal programming elements are part of this deal, could that be the ultimate condition for this kind of merger, given the verticality that you mentioned, which is not the broadband 50%, 30% thing, but a whole nother element of influence?
So I think the vertical integration and between programming and distribution assets is an important part of this merger. I don't think it is the part of the merger that the Commission or the DOJ is spending the most time on. It's an issue that the Commission has tried to resolve through conditions in the past, conditions that have failed to work, particularly for small and medium-sized cable operators. And the Commission is going to have to do better this time around if it approves the merger. But I don't think that those issues are driving consideration of this deal. I think it's more so on the broadband side and the impact on the broadband market. So even if those if the issues that my members are concerned about weren't there, I think we'd still be having the difficult time resolving how to deal with the deal.
Are there any other thoughts on that type of structural merger and how much alleged harm it would alleviate, or no harm at all to alleviate?
I mean, to the extent that the DOJ and the FCC have already identified vertical harms, the question, I suppose, is whether those existing conditions, when you're expanding part of it, the distribution part, maybe to a lesser extent the content part, whether those existing conditions sort of also solve those same harms, or whether, you know, the reason those harms, whether those remedies were sort of enacted, you know, we knew less about how well they would work. The companies, the relative size between the different arms of the company, so to speak, were different. So yeah, I think to an extent you're right. It is probably a lesser part of the deal, but I don't think it's the issue is being ignored. And also, I think in particular markets, the content problems pop up. The MVPDs probably know more about this than I do, but for example, Los Angeles comes up a lot because of particular issues with Time Warner Cable's control of certain sports properties.
Yeah, I mean, the only point I'd make is all these issues were raised and thoroughly examined by the DOJ and the FCC at the Comcast NBCU, and there was very many, I'd say a fulsome list of conditions, which people on this panel may disagree with, but I believe have been complied with and have worked. So I think the potential for competitive harms have been dealt with. So there's nothing new in this transaction about that.
Just really quickly, does anyone have any views on how we can measure whether or not those conditions worked effectively or not? Or, Jeff brought up one example, the dispute with Bloomberg. Are there any other things to look at for the people in the audience to understand how DOJ and FCC will evaluate whether or not those conditions were effective?
I don't know what you can have a metric. I think there have been very few complaints. You can talk about anecdotal, but I mean, as I said, there's at least 150 conditions. I mean, over a period now of 4 years. So you can imagine the thousands of contractual relationships involved, and we just have not heard a great deal of complaints. I think if you want to look at it, so a lot of these conditions were devoted to the development of online video distribution and concerns that merger would somehow harm that. I mean, look at the growth of Netflix. They have, I think, 36 million subscribers, which is more than any cable company, even Comcast, after this deal. I don't think all of us who consume video programming think that we have a small choice of places to go to consume video programming, whether it's Netflix, Amazon Prime, our cable company, satellite, whatever. So I mean, I think you I would say look at the marketplace as it exists today. That's the way to evaluate it.
I would point out that really the only way to get at this question, and it's a really good question, do behavioral remedies or even structural remedies work in mergers? And the way you do that is you look at merger retrospectives. So you look at what happened in previous mergers, and you do retrospectives. You look at the effect on prices, pre and post merger. Did prices go up? What happened to quality? What happened to availability? What happened to innovation? All of these metrics economists have tackled in one form or the other through the merger retrospective. I would note that John Quokka, leading IO economist, is coming out with a new book on mergers and merger remedies that absolutely hits this question nail on the head, because he looks at not only retrospectives, but then he does sort of meta-analysis of those retrospectives and finds that a lot of mergers have resulted in price increases, and a lot of mergers that have been conditioned with structural and particularly behavioral remedies have resulted in price increases. So I think the answer to the question is, can we learn from what's happened in the past? Can we use retrospectives to inform future policy and future merger decisions? Well, we probably should. Learning is an important thing when it comes to antitrust enforcement.
And in DISH's petition to deny and our reply, which we'll be filing next week, we list very significant merger condition violations. I've mentioned some of them: Project Concord, standalone broadband, Bloomberg, data caps. It's all there. It's all footnoted. And I agree with Seth that the market for over-the-top is robust. If this merger is rejected, it's going to be because of the harm to that potential market by giving one company so much control over the broadband pipes that all of these services depend upon. So yes, Netflix is doing well, and Hulu, and Dish is launching our over-the-top service, and Sony. There's a lot of innovation, good things happening, and Chairman Wheeler's statements to this effect, it could give consumers greater choice, more flexibility. That's positive. But then, if one company is going to control the pipes that all these services depend upon, if the DOJ sues and if the FCC designates for a hearing, I think it's going to be primarily because of that. The threat to those services from a company that doesn't want these services to be successful. That's the thing. Xfinity, X1, competes with those services. Comcast wants their subscribers to buy the bundle, not to buy Dish's over-the-top service. And the power that they're going to have over the pipe, where they could stifle and sabotage, slow down, all the different things they can do to damage over-the-top services. If the mergers are rejected, I think it's going to be because of that.
Let's take one more question, maybe, or one last question.
Yeah, I think hopefully it should be quick. Russ, I think you mentioned that your issue, your members' issues, was with programming. And I think, obviously Dish is wanting to have an over-the-top product, and I think Verizon as well. I mean, what I'm wondering is, you know, it seems like the market is naturally coming up with a solution. We're going to have potentially just, you know, an over-the-top, you know, MVPD. Does that address the issue? Because that way you can kind of leverage Dish or Verizon's larger scale, or DirecTV or anybody else's, you know, that has more negotiating leverage with big programmers. And also beyond that, is there any technical issue in terms of having an over-the-top video product, you know, be as seamless as a, you know, a linear video product that's got dedicated channels to it?
Sure. So I think the trend seems to be from the marketplace that we're going to see more over-the-top providers in this marketplace. Right now, it's, you know, right now there's services like Netflix and Hulu that I think are kind of, you know, considered complements to what the MVPD marketplace offers rather than necessarily substitutes. And it's going to be a long time before over-the-top services become true substitutes. So I think a lot of the harms that this deal creates in terms of MVPD getting fair access to programming aren't resolved by the emergence of over-the-top services. And so I think those issues really do need to be addressed in this deal. And you can't just say, oh, you know, over-the-top is coming, and that will kind of resolve the issues for everybody.
I just want to make one more point, because I haven't heard it from the panel or in the audience yet, and that is that you know, we talk a lot about content and the virtues and benefits to consumers of robust competition in the provision of content and the distribution of content. You know, news, information, sports, program, whatever you want to call it, it's not just a commodity. I mean, this is information. This is free speech in a big sense. Having diversity in the media, having multiple sources of news and opinion and debate is really part of our fundamental democratic society. And you're talking about control of that information. You know, the access issue in the middle market, the mergers that we're talking about, it's all about information. And information in a democratic society, particularly in a market economy, a market-based economy, is critical. And not having an undue amount of control over how that information is distributed, it's not just a commodity. It is free speech, and it is critical to protect that and to promote diversity and independence in the media. So I would just put that plug in, because I think it's an important feature here.
I think that's a great comment to end on, in part because I thought it would be really awkward for MSNBC to have a panel discussion on something like this, and that just would be an interesting thing to go back and look at how much MSNBC talked about this from a policy standpoint. So anyway, thanks for joining the panel. We'll have a brief break, and then we'll come back, reconvene at 11:40.